This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. That was Bob Marley. So much trouble in the world. I am Amy Goodman as we return now to my conversation with Noam Chomsky about the economic crisis and how the Obama administration's handling it. Why do you think Obama chose to surround himself?
Because those are his beliefs. I mean, his support comes from his constituency is basically the financial institutions. Just take a look at the funding for his campaign. I mean, the final figures haven't come out, but we have preliminary figures, and it seems to be mostly financial institutions. I mean, the financial institutions preferred him to McCain. They're the main funders for both parties, main core funders for both parties, but considerably more to Obama than McCain. We can learn a lot from campaign contributions. In fact, one of the best predictors of policy around is Thomas Ferguson's investment theory of politics, as he calls it, very outstanding political economist, which essentially, to say it in a sentence, he describes elections as occasions in which groups of investors coalesce and invest to control the state. And he takes a look at the formation of campaign contributors, and it gives you a surprisingly good prediction of what policies are going to be. It goes back a century, New Deal, and so on. So yeah, it can predict pretty well what Obama's going to do. There's nothing surprising about this. It's the norm in what's called political democracy.
Would you have let Citibank, would you have let Citigroup, would you have let the AIG fail?
Well, there are other possibilities. So the government could just take over the viable parts. I mean, parts of them are functioning. Parts are dysfunctional, like what they call the toxic asset parts, the financial manipulations. Well, one thing you could do, which has been suggested by a number of economists like Dean Baker, just take over the good parts, essentially nationalize them, put them under public control. Nationalize means public control, at least if you have a democracy. Not here, but if you had a functioning democracy, it would mean let them be under public control. And the parts that are responsible for the huge losses, just let them go off by themselves. In fact, that would be the way of taking care of the AIG bonuses that everyone's screaming about. In fact, as Baker pointed out, just spin off the parts that were involved in financial manipulations and caused the crisis. Let them go bankrupt, and let the executives try to get the bonuses from a bankrupt firm. Okay, with no legislation necessary. That's what should be done with Citigroup. And in fact, interesting, it's kind of happening. After the breakdown of Glass-Steagall, they did they made use of it under Rubin's direction, among others, to bring in insurance companies and other risky investors. Now they're divesting them. And they're going in the direction of becoming, a commercial bank. Now, incidentally, this is not the first time this has happened. Paul Volcker's on the news today, saying, let's slow down and so on. Well, he's the one who, under Reagan, who helped bail out Citigroup last time they crashed. That time they were Citibank. They had followed World Bank and IMF instructions and lent huge amounts of money to Latin America and were assured by the World Bank that it's all fine, markets will take care of it, etc. Well, and it crashed. Paul Volcker came in, he raised interest rates very sharply. Third world countries, whose payments are tied to U.S. interest rates, couldn't pay their debts. The IMF moved in, took care of it, and essentially recapitalized Citibank. That's the way the system works. You make risky loans, you make a lot of money, and if you get into trouble, we're here to bail you out, namely the taxpayer.
And how do the Republicans differ from the Democrats in this? What do you make of, do you see it as just a minor footnote that Republicans or some of the governors like Palin, like Jindal are saying they're not going to take stimulus money?
I mean, we basically are kind of a one-party state. I think C. Wright Mills must have pointed this out 50 years ago. There's a business party, but it has factions, Democrats and Republicans, and they're different. They have somewhat different constituencies and different policies. And if you look over the years, the population the majority of the population has tended to make out better under Democrats than Republicans. The very wealthy have tended to make out better under Republicans than Democrats. So they're business parties, but they're somewhat different, and the differences can have an effect. However, fundamentally, they're pretty much along the same lines. So take, say, the current financial crisis. Actually, it began under Carter. The late Carter administration is the one that was pushing for financialization of the economy, huge growth of speculative financial capital, deregulation, and so on. Reagan carried it much further, and Clinton continued it. And then with Bush, it kind of went off the rails. So there are differences, but differences within a pretty narrow spectrum. And anyone who's a little off the spectrum, like Nobel laureates in economics who are a couple of millimeters off the spectrum, they're basically on the outside. You can interview them, but they don't show up at the economic summit.
How does the global economy and our own economy relate to the issue of war and U.S. foreign policy?
Well, actually, you had a pretty good interview with Joseph Stiglitz about that a couple of months ago, in which he discussed the relationship he was talking about the Iraq War. And as you'll recall, he pointed out correctly that the Iraq War, which first of all was going to cost trillions of dollars, also had the effect of sharply increasing the price of oil, predictably. And as he pointed out, we could sort of paper that over for a while by a housing bubble. So there was a huge housing bubble, which anyone with eyes open could see. I mean, for a century, housing prices had sort of tracked, the economy, GDP. Then all of a sudden they shot way beyond the trend line, which means there's a bubble and it's going to burst and you get into trouble. But the housing bubble, which was supervised by Alan Greenspan, but the Democrats, actually it started under Clinton, it replaced the tech bubble under Clinton, and it gave an illusion of prosperity, so you didn't see the effects of the rise in oil prices, which went very high. But if you trace all the connections, yes, there's a clear connection, as he pointed out, between a war and the economic crisis. And in fact, it's deeper than that. The U.S. is just in a class by itself in military expenses. It basically matches the rest of the world, and it's far more advanced. Well, that's drawn from somewhere. That's money that's not being used to develop the economy. Now, in fact, you have to add a footnote here, because part of the very high level of U.S. violation of free trade principles is that the economy itself is based on military spending to a substantial extent. So the modern information revolution, computers, the internet, fancy software, and so on, most of that comes straight out of the Pentagon. My own university, MIT, was one of the places where all of this was developed under Pentagon contracts in the 1950s and the 1960s. In fact, that's another critical part of the way the economy works. The public pays the costs and takes the risk of economic development, and if anything works, maybe decades later, it's handed over to private enterprise to make the profits. That's a core element of the economy. Of course, we don't permit the third world to do that. That's considered a violation of free trade when they do it. But it's the way our economy works, and it's kind of complementary to the too big to fail doctrine of protectionism for financial institutions. But we do not have a capitalist economy. We have kind of a state capitalist economy in which the public has a role, pay the costs, take the risks, bail out if they get into trouble. And the private sector has a role, make profit, and then turn to the public if you get into trouble.
Would you extend that to health care?
Well, health care is a dramatic case. I mean, for decades, the health care issue has been right at the top of domestic concerns for very good reasons. The U.S. has the most dysfunctional health care system in the industrial world. It has about twice the per capita costs and some of the worst outcomes. It's also the only privatized system. And if you look closely, those two things are related. I mean, the privatized system is highly inefficient. A huge amount of administration, bureaucracy, supervision, all kinds of things. It's been studied pretty carefully. Now, the public has had an opinion about this for decades. A considerable majority want a national health care system, like other industrial countries have. they usually say a Canadian-style system, not because Canada's the best, but at least you know that Canada exists. Nobody says an Australian-style system, which is much better, because who knows anything about that. But something like what's sometimes called Medicare Plus, like extend Medicare to the population. Well, it's interesting, up until the year 2004, that idea was described, for example, by the New York Times as politically impossible and lacking political support. So maybe the public wants it, but that's not what counts as political support. The financial institutions are opposed, the pharmaceutical institutions are opposed. It's not, no